Allan, who's a professor emeritus at Dickinson College, where he taught for 33 years and was also a senior academic officer for 2 decades. His publications are mainly on topics in social philosophy and philosophy of education, influenced by the metaphysical ideas of process philosophers such as Whitehead and Langer and the American pragmatists. His most recent book is Modes of Learning, Whitehead's Metaphysics and the Stages of Education, through SUNY Press, I believe.
Yeah.
And title of your paper is Diagrams and Myths. Take it away.
Sounds great. During his first Harvard lecture, Whitehead says that metaphysical philosophy, the kind that he's doing for the first time in any formal way, is as near to, quoting, as near to poetry as to science, and needs them both. It's a puzzling claim. Why should metaphysics be near, much less in need of, poetry, that most personal and emotive form of human discourse, an endeavor far, far removed from the maximally impersonal study of being itself? And why should metaphysics be thought in need of the empirically rooted sciences, since the task of metaphysics is to articulate those first principles upon which the theories and laws of any science depends? Whitehead's apparent answer to this is that because metaphysics leaves nothing out, because it seeks a critical appreciation of the whole, because of that everything is its subject matter, from one extreme to the other, from the humanities to the sciences, from poetry to mathematics. True enough, but trivial. It's not just that metaphysics deals with everything, according to Whitehead, but that everything is an interdependent whole, not a unitary lump, not a heap of separable things, not even a well-ordered heap, but a process of events internally related to all other events, a process which all else is the environment for whatever is. Every entity, says Whitehead, expresses itself in the whole of reality, and the rest of reality is patient of it. Everything is distinctively individual, but nothing self-sufficient. The world is a boundless process of emergent structures that are transitions to other structures. It is not just any whole, but an unimaginably dense whole, too dense ever to be fully grasped. What is so crucial about poetry and science is that they offer the tools, the methods by which we can grasp the ungraspable. What these methods are is captured in Whitehead's remark that a diagram is the mathematician's analog to Plato's myth, although Whitehead prefers diagrams because he can't make up myths. But if myths and diagrams are analogs to each other, then it's not just to diagrams, but to myths as well, that we can have recourse, even if supposedly Whitehead can't, to either as a way to gain access to a world too dense to otherwise understand. Whitehead sometimes speaks of a diagram as a picture. It's not, however, because it leaves a lot out. A diagram is a sketch of a region of reality, not a replica of it. Like a road map is a diagram that excludes everything about an area except its roads, which are enlarged quite a bit, and the details of which are the shape is smooth for easier recognition. The diagrams Whitehead draws on the blackboard are extreme in what they omit. Only a few lines remain, indicating relationships relevant to what he is discussing, along with letters that name them. 3 vertical M lines crossed horizontally by P and Q parallel lines illustrate what relativity theory means by congruence, to take one example. Silly little diagrams, Whitehead remarks, but don't be afraid of being silly sometimes. Myths, too, are diagrams, verbal ones, that give you an easier picture. That's Whitehead. Give you an easier picture, a way more convenient psychologically to reason about some particularly complicated thing. This is especially so, says Whitehead, with respect to what he calls ultimate presuppositions, such as electrons or quanta. Electrons are mere myth, he says, a way of stating things. This doesn't mean an electron is a fairy tale about something that isn't there. It is useful only if grounded in verified facts and subject to a formal analysis which gives rise to further verified facts. Electrons refer to objective features of the world, but one dealt with best intermediately in mythic terms, like using graphs, his example, in dealing with unemployment data. The graphs are a helpful way to clarify complex trends, but they're worthless without there actually being unemployed people whose numbers are being totaled. Myths require facts, but are not reducible to them, for they make visible what the facts in their millions obscure. We habitually reason and think with surrogates, of which diagrams and myths are synecdoche. Nor should we distinguish them too carefully. In drawing a diagram of how things grow through retentive endurance, evolution, Whitehead points to the chalk marks and calls that he's on the diagram he's putting on the board, and calls them a myth drawn on the blackboard. Such surrogates are our way of making sense of things, interpreting them in ways we find meaningful. We can do this by abstraction. We can only do this by abstraction, indeed, by isolating a fact with its features and relations, identifying by how we selected its value for us, its relevance to our aims. Devices like myths and diagrams are controls for determining how the data are selected and how organized. Thinking with surrogates is not merely a useful habit, it's a necessary one. With man, says Whitehead, and woman presumably included here, it is not possible to deal with the universe, not possible to deal with the universe without abstraction. Abstraction is necessary, but it can be dangerous if its limits are not recognized. We're familiar with the problems that result from confusing abstractions with the concreteness from which they have been abstracted, committing the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. Whitehead also notes, however, the parallel problem of attempting to achieve more precision than our interpretation requires, committing the fallacy of misplaced abstraction. The art of reasoning is to arrange our abstractions so they bring out by their very nature what is important about what is being investigated, which requires being master of our techniques, exploiting them as far as appropriate, but knowing and respecting their limits. It would be a boon to that attempted mastery were the abstractions we use able to reveal their own limits, to display not only the features they are designed to emphasize, but also the boundaries of those features, the perimeter of the expertise, thereby revealing their beyond. Now, diagrams and myths do this fairly well because they're obviously incomplete, they're obviously partial. A diagram is a sketch, calling attention not only to a formal pattern otherwise easily overlooked, but calling attention by its omission to all sorts of other things having to be excluded in accomplishing the task at hand. A myth is a story, a fanciful account of something that begins with some event from which it moves along to other events until it comes to the one where it ends, conveying not only a truth about those events that might otherwise be overlooked, but also a realization on our part that the story goes ever on toward unexamined consequences and further unmentioned episodes. Or to put it in a slightly different way, diagrams and myths are fundamentally open-ended. They point beyond themselves, reveal that there is more than what they are equipped to handle. Whitehead says nothing in the lectures we're examining about this crucial way in which diagrams and myths are open-ended. He says that metaphysics is beholden to science and poetry, but how is not explicitly discussed. Except in one case, is comments on the function in science of hypotheses. The aim in science may be at theories verified by established fact, but its key tool is the use of hypotheses, which are effective insofar as they offer what Whitehead calls a vague apprehension of a vague sort of relationship. A hypothesis pushes out beyond what is clearly and obviously fact, beyond exact data and tested theories. It directs attention to possibilities of connection not previously explored, one's offering thereby a wider, although fuzzier grasp of things. Fuzzier because you don't have all the verified facts necessary to support it, just some of them. A practice of formulating promising hypotheses cultivates the vividness and delicacy of appreciation that prepares the mind for imagining what was assumed to be unimaginable, for noticing what otherwise would go unnoticed. You do not perceive, says Whitehead, what you're not prepared first to perceive. Even what proves to be a false hypothesis, Whitehead adds, can lead to a right type of observation. What is good, this is what poetry does and what science needs to do as well. A great poem evokes a feeling that the poet has gone beyond his or her own direct experience. We may forget the details, but the apprehension of wonder remains. Having said earlier that a scientist should avoid the wondrously befuddling excitement of seeing a rainbow in order to focus on identifying its causes, Whitehead now applauds the wonder of the rainbow or a skylark's song at dawn for this expansion in vagueness of the frame in which you're functioning by making you alert to and aware of the beyond of where of your current level of knowledge. For we cannot see the inadequacies of a theory unless we are able to imagine a wider harmony, a more adequate pattern of facts. A good hypothesis, says Whitehead, must always allow for ragged edges. The notion of leaving ragged edges on one's hypotheses leads me to a consideration of metaphor, a topic on which Whitehead's lectures, he actually does touch on them slightly, but not in a way that I'm interested in here. But it's crucial to an appreciation of how abstractions can foster open-ended thinking rather than idle speculation on the one hand or unimaginative closure on the other. Let me begin by distinguishing metaphors from analogies. An analogy asserts a similarity between two different things. X is like Y. Whitehead uses analogies frequently. The essential nature of an electron, he reports, is like having tentacles stretching out throughout all space and all time. Justifying the congruence of two time-space systems by saying we discern it is like forecasting the actions of the Republican Party by going to Africa and studying elephants. These are two analogies that Whitehead has. In contrast, a metaphor asserts the identity of two incompatible things. X is Y. We are asked to understand that a light wave is also a particle. That Romeo really means it when he said that Juliet is the sun. An analogy compares two different things in a way that illuminates one or more features of one or both of them. A metaphor turns two different things into one thing, claims not a similarity, but an identity. Contraries, contradictories, and other sorts of incompatibles held together in a metaphor require constant attention because they're consistently boiling over their container. We can try to release the tension by turning the metaphors into analogy. Well, Juliet, you see, is like the sun with respect to her radiance. Light under certain conditions, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, is a wave, but under certain other conditions, it's a particle, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. These escape strategies don't work, however. It's like all those people, says Whitehead, who through the ages burned each other as heretics in order to smooth away the rough edges in their moral belief. When doing mathematics, but also when doing metaphysics, our aim should be creative and critical, not merely utilitarian. For when you've got hold of your concept, you'll find some things it doesn't explain, rough edges. Get up against the rough edges of thought, says Whitehead, and use common sense in judging them, but don't ignore them, since trivial exceptions are sometimes the key to a needed rethinking of theories we think basic and truths we think self-evident. Metaphors help with the rethinking because the essence of a metaphor is its unsettling ragged edges, by means of which, if we have the courage, we may venture into the beyond it discloses. The creative tension of rough edges is ontological as well as epistemological, and this is what the earlier session was already doing here, applying to all forms of physical reality, but most obviously to biological evolution. The emergence of new kinds takes place at an edge between environments, between two fair stabilities with just enough instability there for novel things to be formed, for what he says somewhere else is a niche to be created that allows for novel new formations. And with just enough stability for them once formed to reproduce themselves sufficiently to comprise a flourishing new species or kind. One thing to get a novel organism, it's another thing for that to become a kind of organism. Whitehead will make much of this notion of rough edges, calling them contrasts in his diagram of concrescence in process and reality, in his model of the work of art, in his model of the work of art and adventures of ideas, and in his story about the aim of philosophy and modes of thought. Let me end my essay by examining an interesting metaphor Whitehead introduces in Lecture 20, and to which he returns in Lecture 22, the shadow of truth. Shadows are created by opaque objects intercepting a field of light, leaving a dark area behind them in an outline of their shape. A shadow is an absence. Truth is a primary feature of any fact, a feature without which it is not fact, without which it has no intrinsic value. Truth is a presence. Whitehead's metaphor says that this absence is a presence because it makes a difference for what has presence, and in doing so makes a difference for what is absent in the sense of not yet possible. Whitehead has been elaborating a concept of the eternal with a capital E, which is likely to confuse students and most of us. Whatever is eternal is timeless, he says, and thus is the obvious contradictory of what is temporal and therefore changing. But Whitehead is arguing that the eternal changes, and that it does so because of what is temporal. Now, how this could be possible is bewildering as explaining how there could be a continuum of atomic individuals. Yet it is precisely those individuals that Whitehead is saying are the source of the changes in the eternal, by virtue of which there's a continuity of temporal change. Indeed, the individuality of an atomic entity is disclosed solely through its definite enrichment of the eternal. So note for Whitehead, the eternal change is not on its own initiative, but because of the temporal, and not because of the temporal as such, but because of each particular temporal individual's influence. But how can what perishes change what is not perishable? By perishing, says Whitehead, because as the eternal is now for us, the total nature of the past belongs to it. And so the eternal gets altered because the shadow of truth falls on it. Taken without any reference to what happens, an idea is neither true nor false, just logical or illogical. Truth has to do fundamentally with the question of realization. When we remember some past event, The shadow of its truth falls on our remembering, changing our sense of its importance. As with memory, so with all else, each fact of realization takes its place as an eternal truth that influences whatever happens, altering in some way the character of its influence. Indeed, the very laws of nature are relevant to the past and so altered under its influence. The shadow of truth, of past fact, is the first limitation of the eternal into an eternal as enriched. Whitehead then draws an even more radical conclusion. The eternal is nothing but the unity of its limitations. Truth is fundamentally upon realization. The truth of a fact is its realization. The eternal truth of this realized fact is its alteration of the eternal. In short, change in the eternal is the shadow of truth on it. But furthermore, because a truth is a particular realization, the shadow of an atomic fact, the how of its realization, is always a particularized how, having relevance to the particular. The character of the eternal is thus always particular in its current situation, to the current situation, always changing in a specific way as specific new realizations cast their unique shadows on it. Not general changes, but one context sensitive, because of which their influence can endure and therefore contribute to the preservation and growth of temporal value. Metaphors that, do I have a couple minutes?
Sure.
Metaphors have difficulty holding their concepts firmly within boundaries. Unintended new possibilities keep bubbling up. So let me sketch an interpretation of the shadow of truth, really sketches one paragraph, that I heartily embrace, but that the Whitehead of 2425 wouldn't. Facts have a shadow, which is to say they have an impact. Their impact on successors is the shadow they have cast in their perishing on their particular successors. The past, therefore, is not a mode of being, but an abstraction, a useful bit of myth-making that we should not fallaciously think concrete. There is no actual past. It has no being. The facts, realized, perish and are no more. But their shadow is cast on newly concressing facts in the form of conditions limiting what they can realize. And that influence becomes, strongly or faintly, a feature of the shadow of the successors of those occasions cast on their successors. Understanding the past as a shadow rather than as a reality that casts a shadow, as the truth facts impose on emerging facts, means we need not populate our metaphysical hypotheses with an ontological mode of being somehow real but never accessible, nor do we need to posit an eternal as the ontological ground of all becoming, ever eternal but ever changing, which is, among other things, the repository of this inaccessible past. We can dispense, that is, with God's consequent nature, and hence with God. We've
got about 17, 18 minutes. Got Lehman, Olaf. Hit it.
There are a lot of diagrams in this critical edition. Most of them I found unintelligible, but I wonder if Whitehead acknowledges the point that you were making about how any kind of diagram is an abstraction and a kind of limitation, and the way in which Bergson discusses this spatialization and the sort of way in which the intellect attempts to freeze that which is fluid and temporal. You find these diagrams in principles of natural knowledge, but after that, you don't sort of see diagrams anymore. But Whitehead says, reflecting back on that book, that once he discovers that process is the fundamental idea, he replaces a process with extension. So as long as he's sort of thinking spatially, the diagrams make a lot of seem to make a lot of sense, but, I always felt uncomfortable trying to draw diagrams of prehension or a nexus or things like that on the board, because they really don't get to the essence of what it is that you're trying to describe.
That's right. Some of these diagrams may not, they're bad diagrams in the first place. Whitehead draws a diagram of how reductive science, anatomistic science, Newtonian in its understanding of things, draws one of his little diagrams, 3 lines, crossing lines, or whatever they're doing, of transition. And he says, well, the only way you can do it is to have a series of locations of the entity. Here it is at T1, T2, 3, 2, 3, 4, and there's no transition. It's frozen. There's no transition. And then on the basis of that, he actually do a diagram of transition. But he's used the diagram to show, and he's making the strong claim, insofar as you're holding a standard acceptance scientific notion of transition, let's just say Newtonian, but applies to Einstein just as easily. And he's dealt with Einstein constantly in here. There's no way to represent transition in those diagrams. And so, either you have to do it another way, and I'm blank on whether he actually tries to come up at that point with a diagram. But diagram, I mean, what kind of diagrams you use, whether you use myths instead, whether you use some other route of simplification, you have to have a simplification to gain you access to it. And so you need to come up with simplifications that won't, that give endurance. That is transition. Transition without the transition of something. Transition within and change together. If you're going to be able to have a temporal notion of reality rather than.
Yeah, I think my question was, did Whitehead actually acknowledge that in these lectures, that there are these limitations, that there's a serious problem here with the degree to which these diagrams accurately represent what I'm trying to get at?
He limits himself to diagrams that represent what he's trying to get at, I think.
I mean, he limits it by saying they're a myth, obviously, but more often than not, I find him saying that he really wants or needs to do a diagram to get at what he's saying. So I'm not saying he's overclaiming it, but in some ways he seems like he is trying to say to his students that he wants and needs to. I'm just looking over at Paul.
Is it to get beyond words, though? I'm just wondering if it's to get beyond words, which have that calcifying.
I think,
But maybe diagrams do.
But Brian threw up on the board this morning these other injections where he's saying, this is silly, He says to the class, and I'm going to do this and see if we can get somewhere in communicating with each other with all of the provisos that George has so nicely put together here. But then he says, this is silly, right? I mean, I'm not making up that word, that's his word.
Right.
So, I mean, I think he has this wonderful way of saying, let's do this intently and see if we can get somewhere. But after all, there are limitations to this. It seems to me he says that quite openly. He doesn't repeat it each time.
Yeah.
I don't think this is such a question of evaluativeness. I think it's a question of abstraction.
I can't hear you.
This is not, to me, a question of how Whitehead evaluated diagrams and the limitation. It's rather, the diagrams are abstractions from the concrete reality. And abstractions are necessary. The laws of mathematics, the laws of gravity, etc., they're all abstractions. But you can't understand the flux of the events and the orderliness of the events without making those abstractions. So Whitehead was a critic of the fallacy of abstracting and not understanding the relation of that abstraction to the concrete flux of the events. But he wasn't a critic, he was a proponent of abstraction and the heuristic value.
I agree very much. Yeah.
Olaf?
We were talking earlier this morning about how Whitehead wanted to do justice to both continuity, duration, and atomism, and we somehow have to talk about both, but it seems like when we analyze something, we either have to go for one or the other. How do you talk about both? And I wrote about personal identity at one point, trying to introduce a narrative theory of identity to Whitehead, and so I find it fascinating. I called the book Myths of the Self, and so that he talked about myth is an interesting thing to me here. One of the people I found very helpful there was Paul Ricoeur, French philosopher, who talks, first of all, he wrote a book called The Rule of Metaphor, in which he says that metaphors break the way we normally use the language. Why do they do it? In order to lift up the truth about reality we couldn't have gotten at in any other way. And then he wrote Time and Narrative in 3 volumes, in which he said, I'm doing the same thing with myth now. So lifting up a truth we couldn't have gotten at through purely descriptive language. Joseph Campbell had the same belief. Do you think maybe some of this interest in myth and poetic language is to serve that same function and maybe lift up something that
Yeah, I
we
mean,
couldn't have
remember,
gotten
the
at?
first thing I quoted, first lecture here, it's akin to poetry. Metaphysical philosophy is akin to poetry and to mathematics and to science. It's akin to both of them. It needs them both. So there are some things you can get at better through narratives, through myth. And myth broadly included would be artistic representations, which we'll soon hear about. And the other side can be mathematical, but it could be anything that's quantitative in its approach. We're going to use both of those. But you know, it isn't that this myth, or we would never say it with a diagram, would we? Unless it were some mystical diagram. But it isn't that this reveals some things that weren't there, that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise, but this doesn't reveal any final truth. I mean, this isn't a shortcut to any of the other things, because of course it reveals these things, but that grasp of things is also inadequate.
It's almost like it points us to something, right? It's like,
Whitehead I've summarized Whitehead in this way. The necessary requirements for metaphysics, for philosophy, is that it be adequate on the one hand and coherent on the other, and the other two are unimportant relatively to those two. You have to be adequate and you have to be coherent. The only way you can be coherent is to lose adequacy, and the only way you can be adequate is to lose coherence. So you're always trying to find you're trying to muddle through. It's one of the reasons why we're muddled in what we're doing. That's the best we can come up with. You know, so, but if we're aware that that's the case, if we're aware that there's always more than we've managed to capture in our words, in our theories and whatnot, then we're going to be okay. And what I thought was interesting about it in this discussion is that diagrams and myths are so obviously opening out more than they're talking about, more than they're showing, that they had built into them the open-endedness that, say a scientific theory doesn't have built into it. And it's our tendency is what is it in the function? And since in the function of reason, practical reason always is coming toward closure, because that's the way in which we can get by until tomorrow. And our drive at closure, at something comfortable and familiar, is always cutting us off from the realization that, yeah, but it won't always do.
I've got Jude, Paul, Richard, Alyosha, George. So Jude.
Yeah, I wanted to take you up on your little provocation at the end. I'll give you the consequent nature. You can take that away.
Okay, I'm okay.
But I'm kind of wondering about applying something you said early on to what I think becomes the primordial nature, what part of what he does with the eternal here. We were talking about this yesterday. You said, a practice of formulating promising hypotheses cultivates the vividness and delicacy of appreciation that prepares the mind for imagining what was assumed to be unimaginable, for noticing what otherwise would go unnoticed. You do not perceive what you're not prepared to perceive. Quoting, even what proves to be a false hypothesis, Whitehead adds, can lead to a right type of observation. And I'm wondering if, playfully or seriously, you'd entertain the idea that the primordial nature of God might be a false hypothesis that leads to the right kind of observation, and that nothing else will do.
Oh, that nothing else will do.
Or in the absence of something like it, we're kind of leaving off a really big piece of the explanatory process.
You know, that phrase in Whitehead is in Adventures of Ideas. And I've always thought, it's sometimes better to be interesting than to be right. But boy, it's best to be both interesting and right. And I think in the context, if it isn't right, it doesn't survive. It really, since it's not in any way, it's got too many problems with it. And I guess I'd love to be able to handle the primordial nature of God simply that way. But there's all sorts of things that we would look back to in the past and say are simply false beliefs.
Yeah.
And yet at the time they weren't, they did the job at the time. So we didn't think they were false beliefs, but they were in fact false beliefs that were very fruitful that led us beyond them.
But given the important role that the eternal here does in terms of providing or naming a ground of comparability and value, that I'll playfully say might even be the ground of the possibility of metaphor, right? Things need to be comparable to one another, right? I just don't see how we can do without that.
Let's maybe keep that as in the air and take it up again in your presentation. So we can get to a couple more.
With the God problem?
That's right. I did just do that. So we got Paul, Richard, Alyosha, George. Paul.
Gee, after this lofty topic, I actually, I was thinking about the difference between those of us in the room that have worried about Whitehead over decades, or even months, whatever it might be.
More than a decade.
But not being, by comparison with the students in his class. I mean, the diagrams were done for people who had not studied Whitehead or written papers about him or, made up their mind what they thought was going on there. But many of us now are in this awkward position of having kind of made up our mind about some things here. And it's not only that we're hearing how he would go about doing these lectures, we're seeing him stand up to the board and doing some sketches.
Yeah.
And with all the provisos, I quite agree with that you've outlined here so nicely. There's a real threat here, right? What if you turn the page and he's doing a diagram and you say, oh, shoot, I never thought that's what he was saying. And it doesn't have to be final, it doesn't have to reach closure, it just has to be provocative. And I guess I can't quite turn this into a question about going around the room and saying, did any of you find stuff there that you wouldn't have expected or made you realize you had better rethink that? But isn't it interesting to be confronted with diagrams when we've been dealing with Whitehead for so long without them? As you say, there aren't any post the inquiry. In my appraisal, the ones in the inquiry are kind of have more to do with his teaching mathematical physics.
That was an extensive abstraction.
Yeah.
Which made sense.
There's all sorts of diagrams of actual occasions. But in a sense, Whitehead sets that up by
In here.
phases.
In here.
Yeah.
Not in the published works.
Yeah, and that.
Not at, when you say
Oh, excuse me, yes. No, I mean, Sherburne did a bunch of it in here.
Sherburne,
Yeah.
It's interesting what Sherburne
Teachers
says.
do this all the time, but they do it for the appropriate reason of
Yeah.
trying to help you understand what's going on in terms of the phases of concrescence.
Well, Sherburne says, interestingly enough, that this diagram is like, or is it, it's like a picture of me shaking hands with Napoleon. Yeah.
Very, very pithy.
Richard.
Very pithy quote.
Richard?
Yeah, Whitehead wrote the worst homage we can pay to genius is to accept uncritically formulations of truth which we owe to it. So I got myth, and I got diagram, and then you went on to shadows, and we're talking about truth, but we're not seeing the truth, we're seeing the shadow of the truth. And then I hear reflections, or I hear echoes from the myth of the cave of the shadows. I hear Plato in that we're not looking at truth, we're looking at the shadow of truth.
Yeah, that won't work in this case.
And why is that? I mean, because it's truth and it's a shadow.
What? Truth, well, truth is a feature, a characteristic of actuality, right? So the only thing that's true is an actuality. And the question is, and so the shadow then is functioning as an influence on that actuality. Because the past perishes, and we've got past perishes. How does that concrescence ever get? How is it get? How can it possibly be? How can the new emerging be influenced by the old? And so the shadow, it is a metaphor. The shadow of the past is that influence. It's the shadow of the past, as a shadow of the truth, because the shadow of truth, because it isn't truth, because it isn't actuality.
Well, I just thought it was a very good fit. I think the myth of the cave, because we're talking myth, and we're talking diagram, and they're all imperfect ways of perceiving.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to Alyosha and George at the moment. We're going to now turn to Helmut Maaßen, who's giving a paper on the central role of aesthetics in Whitehead's Metaphysics. Helmut teaches philosophy at Heinrich Heine University in Dusseldorf and is the editor of the book series European Studies in Process Thought. He has spent research sabbaticals at Boston University and at Nehru University in Delhi. He taught at Claremont School of Theology here in 2007. He's published several books on Whitehead and Peirce, numerous scholarly articles. He's also the International Book Review Coordinator for Germany of Process Studies. He's the president of the German Whitehead Society and president of the European Society for Process Thought and finance director of the International Process Network that sponsors the regular International Whitehead conferences. They just had one in Azores. And so, join me in welcoming Allan.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to be back here in Claremont to see old friends and may be able to make new friends. So let me deal with the topic which I've chosen. You saw already what it's supposed to be all about. And I'll give you a slight overview of what my paper is supposed to be. Aesthetics and process metaphysics, music and aesthetics, interplay of music and process metaphysics, and conclusion. First, aesthetics in process metaphysics. Aesthetics, as you probably know, does not play a major role in philosophical discourse. Beauty goes back, though, to ancient Greece, Plato, Aristotle, and so on, but they did not subsume it in a special category. Aesthetics was first established as a separate discipline in Aesthetica 1750 by Alexander Gottlieb Baumgart. The marginal role of aesthetics is reflected in the Whiteheadian discourse as well. There are only 3 monographs in English on Whitehead's aesthetics, And I'm sorry, I was not able to read your book so far, so it will be excluded, has to be excluded. First one, 1961, Donald Sherborne, Whiteheadian Aesthetic. 2009, Stephen Shaviro, Whitehead without criteria, Kant, Whitehead, Deleuze, and Aesthetics. In 2016, Stephen Odin, Tragic Beauty in Whitehead and Japanese Aesthetics. First monograph on Whitehead's aesthetics was Sherborne's doctoral dissertation from 1959 in Yale. The next one was published in 2009, 50 years later, and most recently the book by Steve Odin. Rainer Wiel from Heidelberg, he passed away in 2010, was among the first who pointed out the central role of aesthetics in Whitehead's Metaphysics. Later, in 1990, Leonard Wessel, in fact an American philosopher, wrote the PhD thesis in German under Rainer Wiels guidance zur Funktion des Ästhetischen in der Kosmologie Alfred North Whiteheads in 1990. The title indicates that aesthetics is regarded a basic concept in Whitehead's cosmology. The subtitle of Sherborne's book, Whiteheadian Aesthetic, Some Implications of Whitehead's Metaphysical Speculation, is telling. Aesthetics is seen as a concept of fine arts implied in Whitehead's metaphysical system. Only the others assume a central role of aesthetics for Whitehead's metaphysics. A similar objection can be made when he speaks of an aesthetic object. The aesthetic object for Sherborne is always, implicitly or explicitly, an art object. Quote, in this chapter, it will be argued that art objects have the ontological status of a Whiteheadian proposition. Crucial to this argument is this distinction between works of art and their performances, which will be shown to be the distinction between propositions and their objectifications. This essay presents a general aesthetic theory, not a theory of this or that particular art. Therefore, it will apply its doctrines to all major arts, music, the dance, literature, including poetry, and the theater, architecture, painting, and sculpture. So far, Sherborne. The restriction of aesthetics to art is the main shortcoming, I think, of Sherborne's otherwise thoughtful and detailed monograph. Leonard Wessel lists the following central texts of Whitehead's oeuvre to support his thesis that aesthetic is central. Quote from Modes of Thought, by reason of the greater concreteness of the aesthetic experience, it is a wider topic than that of logical experience. Indeed, when the topic of aesthetics has been sufficiently explored, it is doubtful whether there will be anything left over for discussion. Rigid in the making, thus, God is the measure of the aesthetic consistency of the world. There is some consistency in creative action because it is conditioned by his immanence. And then the third quote, this line of thought extends Kant's argument. He saw the necessity for God in the moral order. But with his metaphysics, he rejected the argument from the cosmos. The metaphysical doctrine here expounded finds the foundations of the world in the aesthetic experience, rather than, as with Kant, in the cognitive and conceptive experience. All order is therefore aesthetic order, and the moral order is merely certain aspects of aesthetic order. The aesthetic order is derived from the immanence of God. So Jude has some quotes already for challenge. And then finally, an actual fact is a fact of aesthetic experience. All aesthetic experience is feeling arising out of the realization of contrast and identity. An actual fact has been called a fact of aesthetic experience. This statement puts reality, characterized as experience, into aesthetic brackets, so to speak. Aesthetic experience is the broadest possible experience. Order is aesthetic order, and the moral order is merely certain aspects of aesthetic order. Wessel found more texts, of course, in Whitehead's oeuvre where aesthetics is dealt with. In fact, he counted the number of times Whitehead uses the term aesthetics, 142 times. There are other terms, of course, which are relevant, for example, for aesthetics, for example, especially the concept of beauty has to be considered as well, which Wessel did not. Steve Shaviro, in his book Without Criteria, Kant, Whitehead, Deleuze, and Aesthetics from 2009, shares Wessel's general assumption concerning aesthetics in Whitehead's Metaphysics, but widens the general spectrum of aesthetics. His interpretation of Whitehead's aesthetics allows him to prevent dogmatism in Whitehead studies, really necessary, I think, to keep the system open, to allow for creativity. He does this by a subtle interpretation of Kant's critique of judgment. Quote, Kant's theory of the beautiful is really a theory of effect and of singularity, and it implies an entirely new form of judgment. In the analytic of the beautiful, in the third critique, Kant steps back from the legitimizing and universalizing project of the first two critiques in order to problematize universalization and legitimization themselves. Beauty cannot be judged according to concepts. It is a matter neither of empirical fact nor of moral obligation. This is why there is no science of the beautiful. For Kant, aesthetics has no foundation, and it offers us no guarantees. Rather, it throws all norms and values into question or into crisis. Shaviro does not follow the most common discussion on Kant's critique of judgment, namely the sublime, but the concept of the beautiful. This might seem to be old-fashioned, but according to Shaviro, it allows an unprecedented way of interpreting Whitehead and Deleuze too, incidentally. Let me mention in passing that the famous art critic and philosopher Arthur Danto, who gives a similar interpretation of Kant in his last book of 2013, What Art Is, which would allow this Kantian concept of aesthetics to incorporate even modern forms of art. I skip this quote from Danto here. According to Shaviro, Whitehead stresses the function of art because of its psychopathic effect, free from pressure and restrictions. Quote, art in particularly is important, Whitehead says, because of the way that it offers us an intensity that is divorced from the dire necessity or compulsion which was its origin. In view of this displacement, art can be described as a psychopathic response of the race to the stresses of its existence. And this psychopathic functional art is a necessary one, for it shakes us out of the feeling of slow relapse into general anesthesia or into tameness, which is its prelude. As one can find in Kant already, he goes on to say, there is no criterion that can serve as the stable and objective basis for a system of judgments. This is why the only form of valuation or graded envisionment that Whitehead accepts is an aesthetic one. For aesthetic judgments are singular, unrepeatable, and ungeneralizable. They may be exemplary, as Kant suggests, but they cannot provide an actual rule to be followed. Quote from Kant. Or, as Whitehead puts it, there's not just one ideal order which all actual entities should attain and fail to attain. In each case, there is an ideal peculiar to each particular actual entity. It might be helpful to study the diagram on aesthetics by Charles Hartshorne, which I assume is an abstract listing of Whitehead's main thoughts on aesthetics. He has summarized the abstract notion of aesthetics in several diagrams. I would like to use the diagram of aesthetic values from Wisdom as Moderation from 1987. Just have a short look. Some people might be familiar with it. You have beautiful in the center. You have undiversified unity or absolute order on top. At the bottom, ununified diversity, absolute disorder, and then triviality on the one side, ultra complex on the other, and then with subcategories: sublime, superb, neat, tidy, commonplace, pretty, comic, ugly. Randy Orshia summarizes Hartshorne's aesthetics as follows: beauty exists when an experience is adapted to the capacity and history of the experiencing being in such a way that the experience has both intensity and unity in variety, in just the right proportion. This insight is the key to Hartshorne's aesthetics. The most recent publication on Whitehead's aesthetics, Steve Oden's Tragic Beauty in Whitehead and Japanese Aesthetics, was published only last year. Its first part is entitled Primacy of Aesthetics. In its opening section, he states, Whitehead's process metaphysics endeavors to overturn the tradition of Western rationalism and moralism by establishing the primacy of aesthetic values. The basic task of Whitehead's process metaphysics is to counter the problem of vacuous actuality or valuelessness by recovering the aesthetic value of beauty in art, nature, and everyday life. In his philosophy of culture, he further argues that the aesthetic experience of beauty in art is a defining quality of civilization. In a detailed analysis, Oden shows the continuous stress on aesthetics in all of Whitehead's writings, from principles of natural knowledge to modes of thought. His thought on the penumbral beauty of darkness and shadows in Whitehead's process aesthetics are an important further qualification on Whitehead's aesthetics. He gives this kind of picture and describes it in the following way. In an important passage from Science and Philosophy, Whitehead describes philosophy as an effort to penetrate beyond the clear focus of immediate experience to the dim consciousness of a penumbral background. Thus, the task of philosophy is to penetrate beyond the more obvious accidents to those principles of existence which are presupposed in dim consciousness as involved in the total meaning of seeming clarity. In the focus of experience, there is a comparative clarity, but the discrimination of this clarity leads into the penumbral background. The problem is to discriminate exactly what we know vaguely. What more is to be said? There's still something missing in all the works which stress the central role of aesthetics in Whitehead. Although all of them analyze, describe, and evaluate Whitehead's considerations on aesthetics, they leave out one of the fine arts all through: music. Second part, music in aesthetics. The composer, conductor, and music critic Robert Schumann, who has been music director in Düsseldorf, our hometown as well, once remarked that the best way to talk about music is silence. Nevertheless, I will write about the function of music in aesthetics with a focus on Whitehead's process metaphysics, an area which has been widely neglected. This is a particularly crucial desideratum because of the close affinity of music to numbers and logic for a well-known mathematician as Alfred North Whitehead. He valued music to be as creative as pure mathematics. Quote, "The science of pure mathematics in its modern developments may claim to be the most original creation of the human spirit." Another claimant for this position is music. Philolaus is said to have claimed that anything that can be understood has a number. Pantagramman ta ginokos komena arithmon echonti. Aristotle extended it further ontologically. Any being consists of numbers. Numbers are the principles of nature, pases, tes, physios, etc. The oldest treatise on music is by St. Augustine. Augustine's small Tractatus de Musica has been widely neglected, and work on it has been done only recently. The critical edition of the Latin text was published as late as January 2017. De Musica. Augustine gives a short definition of music. Musica est scientia bene modulandi. Music is the science of good modulation. This definition is probably taken from Varro's lost book on music, and therefore Augustine's is the oldest one. Unlike other sciences, the science of music is related to two classical subjects, mathematics and grammar. Measuring relies on the proportion of reality, including sounds, but Augustine gives it a special focus. He introduces dimensio, an additional factor. The easiest way to explain it may be to relate it to the Latin origin, dimensio or dimensio, two ways of measuring. One, in the traditional way of numbers, rhythmus, the Latin rhythmus, and the Greek rhythmos. Well then, consider the nature and force of reason to the extent that we can observe it from its activities. For reason to focus especially on that which is relevant for the understanding of this work, first pondered over what a good modulation is, and saw that it consists in some kind of movement that is free and turned into a role of its own beauty. And by the way, Augustine does this analysis in analyzing a chant, a hymn, which is known, Deus Creator Omnium, without theological or metaphysical presuppositions. It's a theory of music related to musical experience, which one would not expect from people of that age or from Augustine. The surprising element of beauty for itself and free movement prove the modernity of Augustine's approach to music. The free movement allows the inclusion of the small differences which a strict numerical application to sound creates. The Pythagorean comma, for example, which some of you might know. The correlation of sounds and the length of the string was detected by Pythagoras on the monochord. This is taken up by Augustine. Harmony can be created by whole integral numbers, 1 to 2 for the octave, 1 to 3, 1 to 4, etc. The close similarity of octaves, for example, seems almost universally accepted in the Western European musical system and the Arabic, Indian, and even gamelan music of Indonesia. Taking these thoughts on music into account, it becomes evident which central role music, especially harmony and rhythm, plays in Whitehead's work. Chapter 8 of part 4 of Whitehead's An Inquiry Concerning the Principle of Natural Knowledge is entitled Rhythms. So some of it reads like Augustine's distinction between rhythmos and rhythmus. A rhythm involves a pattern, and to that extent is always self-identical. But no rhythm can be a mere pattern, for the rhythmic quality depends equally upon the differences involved in each exhibition of the pattern. The essence of rhythm is the fusion of sameness and novelty, so that the whole never loses the essential unity of the pattern, while the parts exhibit the contrast arising from the novelty of their detail. A mere recurrence kills rhythm as surely as does a mere confusion of differences. Objects are alive if they have a rhythmic character, according to Whitehead. Quote, all life-bearing objects is not a uniform object. Life, as known to us, involves the completion of rhythmic parts within the life-bearing event, which exhibits that object. Wherever there is some rhythm, there is some life. You will recall, and it was mentioned already, that Whitehead speaks of the rhythm of education, that the objects of learning need to have life, that is, have to have a rhythmic character. Knowledge does not keep any better than fish, as he says in English. Very interesting. To list the musical elements in Whitehead's writing is beyond the scope of this paper. Let us recall a few references. In Science and the Modern World, you find this system forming the primordial element is nothing at an instant. It requires its whole period in which it manifests itself. In an analogous way, a note of music is nothing at an instant, but it also requires its whole period in which to manifest itself. To know that this system includes the harmony of logical rationality and the harmony of aesthetic achievement, to know that while the harmony of logic lies upon the universe as an iron necessity, the aesthetic harmony stands before it as a living ideal, molding the general flux in its broken progress towards finer, subtler issues. The flux, the interplay of meter and rhythm, is familiar to anybody who reads or practices music. Purely metric play would be dull. A just wild, rhythmic play would be incomprehensible. Meter and rhythm require each other to create something which is alive. For example, a melody or a beat. Although written in 4/4, the third Brandenburg Concerto is almost an example of modern music. Every bar is in a different meter. Meter and rhythm transcend each other. The same applies to any performance of music. Look into any score, it be Don Giovanni or a piano concert and so on. And at this point, I'm trying to show you the score. Is running close.
Not yours.
Not mine, but it's here. Yeah. Can you put in electric? The chord is really short. Okay.
So, where's?
Yeah.
Only 15 minutes left, so if we're gonna have any time for Q&A, make sure we
Yeah. No sound. Well, this is one example. I was going to give another, which you can find in the full copy, but I have to read 1.5 pages on the interplay of music and process metaphysics so that it becomes more obvious. In 1997, Oxford University Press published a groundbreaking book on musicology called Meter as Rhythm by the Harvard musicologist Christopher Hastie. The close affiliation to process metaphysics is mentioned already in his introduction of his masterpiece. Quote, the second part of this book develops a theory of musical meter that would, as Alfred North Whitehead says, take time seriously. This taking seriously means acknowledging a real past, present, and the future. Or, perhaps more to the point, acknowledging real potentiality, indeterminacy, and novelty, the condition sine qua non of music making. And he gives a nice quote from Goethes Kant, der Faust: Wer will das Lebendige erkennen und beschreiben, sucht erst den Geist herauszutreiben, dann hat die Teile in seiner Hand, fehlt leider nur das geistige Band. To know and note the living, you will find it best to first dispense with the spirit. Then, with the pieces in your hand, aim. We are only lost the spiritual bond. When Hastie describes the central topic of this endeavor, he introduces the central analytic concept of the book, metrical or durational projection, and says that it is here that my debt to Whitehead's work is most pronounced, although I do not engage Whitehead's elaborate philosophical distinctions and terminology in my questions concerning measured duration. I do freely adapt some of his central insights to the very specific problem of musical meter. You may be surprised to find a modern composer using process metaphysics to understand music. His name is Richard Elphin Jones. The Welshman studied at the Bangor University, King's College, and now teaches at Cardiff University. He uses a fairly known piece of classical music in interpretation, yet in a Whiteheadian manner, the prelude of Book 1 of the Well-Tempered Clavier, which unfortunately I would have to leave, but to get to my conclusion, the affinity of process metaphysics and aesthetics, especially to music, seems to be evident. It runs through all of Whitehead's works, from the inquiry to modes of thought. This is evident in the lecture notes of Volume 1, which I have given in the abstract as well, so I can skip that. Whitehead is not the only one to grant aesthetics a central role in his Metaphysics. Charles Sanders Peirce joins him, among others, in the assumption that logic and ethics are based on aesthetics. In a letter to William James from 1902, he writes, "I obtained the proof that logic must be founded on ethics. I was for some time stupid, so stupid as not to see that ethics rests in the same manner on aesthetics. By which, needless to say, I don't mean milk and water and sugar." Thank you.
So I've got two in the queue here, but just to extend the chair's prerogative to jump in first and to not sound too cranky, but to maybe say what George did, which was I wrote this book in 2005, Ethics of Creativity, Beauty, Morality, and Nature, a Process of Cosmos. In 2010, Recentering Process, Thought, Beauty, and Whitehead's Late Thought. In 2011, Trusting in the Efficacy of Beauty, extensively quoted by Odin himself throughout the book. And the penumbral and the shadow will be interesting. I'm hoping for Steve to have these passages on the shadow of truth passages, given his extensive use of drawing from the Japanese aesthetics and their use of shadow and absence. Will be interesting for him to look at these lecture notes as well to see what new things can be learned there. So Jason.
Sure. Well, I learned this morning it cannot be a footnote on Augustine. It has to be a footnote on Plato. I wonder why you don't talk about Plato here. So we have the last dialogue, the idea of doing music, right? And I listen to scholars of classics who talk about the beautiful jokes that are told musically in Plato. And I've heard a political scientist who's also a pianist set sections of Plato's Republic to music. And it seems like it's accurate, right? That there's a whole vision of harmony in the universe. So why not trace this back to Plato? Why only begin with Augustine?
Well, it's true, but I think to a large extent, as far as music is concerned, Plato, if I may say so, I haven't heard these papers you're referring to, is being misrepresented. I mean, there's a famous quote which you find on many web pages of musicians. You know, music is that which touches the soul most. But then when you go on and read it further, he makes very clear distinctions. You know, it has to be only what I would call a very dull form of music. It should not affect your passions, for example, because that's if you want to educate people, the passion should be kept quiet and so on. So in that sense, it's you could start with Plato, but then you would have to do it in such a way that you would say what you were indicating as well, that there's a certain form of musical structure, so to speak, in dialogues like in the last one.
Well, and I would say, I think the Republic, there's kind of a funny hermeneutic there. So this is music after you've kicked Homer out, right? And then, of course, you get Homer brought back into it. The symposium, things go awry when you kick the girl flutist out, and then things kick back into rhythm when she comes back in the room, right? And so I think there that what Socrates, Plato are entertaining in that part of the Republic, this is part of the Elenchus, right? That's not Plato's own serious. It's rather an answer to Glaucon's question, how can we maintain the society which is fit for luxury and war? Well, then you need music to be marshals, you create soldiers, but I take that to be rejected by Socrates, Plato, by the end of the book.
By Socrates,
Yeah.
Is it Ken?
Yes.
Ken.
Thank you. It was a wonderful paper. And thanks for focusing on music. Yes, of course, Plato deals with music. Augustine too, but really in terms of what we know as music, if we listen to music from Augustine's time or Plato's time, we probably run screaming out of the room. Modern music really began with late medieval, early Renaissance, and so forth. Yeah, I don't know how many people know that Descartes' first treatise was on music. It seems almost unknown, but if you look it up, it's there. Then later on, philosophers don't deal very fairly with music. Kant in the Third Critique dismisses it as a pretty art. And Hegel lived at the same time as Beethoven, but only mentions Rossini in his aesthetics. Don't understand it all. So the correspondence between making music and the aesthetic, and the aesthetic and really aesthetic is first philosophy, which is what I think you're aiming at. What method would you use to get there? How do you get from the fact of music to an aesthetic appreciation of music, to aesthetics as essentially a first philosophy, or the aesthetics of everyday experience, as you said?
That's the sad part of being limited as far as time is concerned.
Okay.
Not just...
Nobody limited you. I tried. I failed.
Well, I was trying to open the discussion to exactly what you are asking in presenting you Elphine Jones' interpretation of the beginning of the prelude of the Well-Tempered Piano.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an attempt which still would have to be discussed. The basic point of analysis should happen, but for that you would have to be a musicologist as well. And we have a student who is doing musicology plus masters in philosophy. And I don't know whether you're familiar with Christopher Hasty's work. I mean, he does analyses of Schoenberg in a Whiteheadian way as much as Wagner or Strauss songs and so on. And that field has been completely neglected. I mean, it's a masterpiece as far as musicology is concerned, but hasn't been discussed in the philosophical realm.
Yeah, thanks for drawing our attention to the Jones work and the work on meter as rhythm. You mentioned that. It's a fascinating title because, of course, meter and rhythm are separate ideas, as you pointed out.
We should probably, is this a separate second
No,
question?
it's okay, go ahead.
Good. And then George, and then Olaf.
An observation and question. The perception of rhythm is a very interesting ontological phenomenon, because if there were great walls rather than bridges between the passage of time, there would be no perception of rhythm. More drama or other art form. The question is, I've often thought the creation of a composition is a much more creative act of genius than the playing of that composition. Performance is also filled with composition. But from a Whiteheadian ontological perspective, are we really creating music? Is the composer really creating music or painting, or is he discerning? Because in the realm of eternal objects, there are relations, pitches, durations, accents, etc. These are patterns, same thing in painting, same thing in dance. So in a certain sense, and I want your comment, from my sense, ontologically, even the composer to whom we attribute this very high level of creativity is in fact discerning relations among eternal objects, rhythms, extensions, pitches, colors, etc.
As much as theologians might like to stick onto creatio ex nihilo, I think what you say about creation as far as music is concerned, it's absolutely right.
Yes.
There's no creation out of nothingness as far as music is concerned. I think it's very important. And I was trying to, I mean, the paper is pretty short, trying to show, for example, even in the early work, how rhythm plays a central role in describing what Whitehead calls life. So in that sense, even that already reflects, rhythmic structure is everywhere, according to Whitehead.
There's that creative genius feel a sense of modesty, but they didn't create it, but they discovered certain patterns and rhythms.
George, and then Olaf.
On that last point, that fifth phrase, just quickly, and then to the point I want to do is that Robert Mesley, some of you probably probably know him, he has been a review editor for a long time. But back when we were graduate students together, we used to examine in Whiteheadian terms, from the standpoint of prehension and feeling, how it was possible that an artist conceive of a musical work like the Edinburgh Concerto, records that in the particular style of writing that music involves. And then other artists have their own intuitions about what this is. They hold instruments in their hands, and suddenly what was the conception of the original composer or something based upon it comes into being. That's a remarkable series of transitions to try and account for ontologically. And we thought only Whitehead would be capable of doing that. Now, early on in your paper, you faulted, well, slightly, Don Sherburne for having dealt only with art, fine art, in his account of aesthetics. There is a famous story that Paul Weiss, who did work on aesthetics on all sorts of different modes and modalities, during Sherburne's doctoral examination, called him to account on just the same point. Well, it's a great theory you got here, Sherburne, but can it illustrate any actual forms of art? What does it say about the dance? Sherburne didn't know what to say, and he tried to, as any doctoral student would in his examination, make a case, and then, well, if you can't do anything with real art, what about pseudo art? What about burlesque? And Sherburne replied, well, I guess we'd have to say that burlesque is the dance stripped of its propositional form. So, in your case, with music, would all of the things you say at the end of your paper, Helmut, with that wonderful paper, would you be as confident in using as illustration something a little less rhythmic than a Brandenburg concerto, something like Stravinsky's Rites of Spring, something and Whitehead account of that?
I would have liked to have explained more the interplay of music and time according to Augustine. That's partly, Augustine has the first book on music. That's again another reason why. And there, of course, any form of musical length, what you might call a melody, has something which I think is closest to Whitehead, or tries to explain as what the concretional of an actual entity is. It has this prediction, you have to predict something. Mm-hmm. You have to have something from the past. It's being created. While it's created, you hear it. Mm-hmm. And once you reflect about it, it's already gone again. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in that sense, I could have given samples of Cage, John Cage or something, which would apply in a similar way to Stravinsky or any piece of music, which I find thrilling, and that's of course what Hasty is doing.
But harder to anticipate, harder to hold together.
Well, that's a question. It's a question of how much you are used to certain forms of music. And that's an old tradition. If you're not familiar with a piece, it's again Augustine. He takes a known hymn of Ambrosius, Deus Creator Omnium, and then you can have this expectation, about the past, and then the creative process will be present while it's being presented. And as soon as if you are not able to do this kind of prediction, that means then you say, I don't understand this music.
Most of the lectures on time consciousness uses music as a way of showing how an episode requires this retention. Yeah. And it's sort of a finite duration, but it's It's a very complicated thing. I encourage you to keep at it. This is wonderful work.
Well, that's Confessiones Book 11, basically,
Yeah.
which has a very intricate, of course, description.
We're a little bit into the break, but we, well, I was going to go to Olaf. We can maybe do a short one, then continue in the break if you had any.
It's very quick, really. I was glad you mentioned Kant at the beginning of your discussion, because there was a question this morning about going to pre-Kantian modes of thought, and yet he was so influenced by Kant at the same time, so how can we work that out? Well, when he introduces the reformed subjectivist principle, he begins with this analysis of Kant, and one of the things he says there is that Kant should have put the transcendental aesthetic first, and then going from there. So you could almost see Whitehead's whole philosophy from that standpoint too, of just working out of what would happen if you put the aesthetic first.
Yeah, good point.
Critique of pure feeling, I think he could.
Yeah.
All right, let's take a bit of a break. And we'll be back here for 4:30 for George's lecture.